You here for a while? Hi, Jacob.
Hey there.
All right, good. Good afternoon, everyone. This is the regularly scheduled meeting of the Ways and Means Committee, and I'm John Quincy, Chair of the committee, and we're joined by Councilmember Johnson, Bender, Vice President Glidden, Councilmembers Palomasano, Yang, and joined today by Jacob Fry. Although he's not on this committee, we're excited to have him here. So I think we've got a number of consent items I think we can process here through pretty quickly, and we look forward to our 3 discussion items today on various financial reports. So we'll get to those in a moment. The first item on the agenda is the 2 legal settlements, one with Theophilus Hunter and one with Sadat Al-Had versus the city. The second item is an administrative clerical personnel services item. It's authorizing amendment for the standard agreement between the city and Gene Thorne to increase the amount of the contract by $40,000 for some legal services support. The third item is the convention center, authorizing an amendment to increase the contract with Black Constructors for closeout and final payment of restoration or repairs on the 3rd Avenue parking ramp in the amount of $33,069.49. Human Resources Department brings forward an item authorizing HR Department to enter into an agreement with Employee Strategies for Leadership Development Program design and delivery in the amount of $230,650. Next item is extending a contract with Safari Books Online, increasing the contract by $28,000 and $28,006 for a new total not to exceed $50,000 for employee training and professional development resources. Neighborhood Community Relations Department brings forward a resolution authorizing acceptance of $3,600 in exhibit hall revenue and accepting $1,250 for financial contributions from the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe related to the Community Connections Conference. The Health, Environment, and Community Engagement Committee brings forward a number of items. One is the authorizing the Neighborhood and Community Relations Department Director to enter into 3-year contracts with Abu Ike and Myers, Clifton Larson Allen, Mike Wilson and Associates, and Rogers and Company in the total amount not to exceed $300,000 to provide audit services, financial management, and report filing services. Tobacco Prevention Services is coming from, a contract with Laura Olivian Cyberfarb. I apologize for the name. Increase the contract by amount up to $50,000 for unexpended funds for Community Transformation Grant. Next item is Minnesota Coalition for Battered Women, accepting estimated revenue of $5,000 from the Minnesota Coalition for Battered Women for participation in Project Connect, and increase the appropriation and revenue estimate by $5,000. Then there's an execution of agreement with Minnesota Department of Public Safety to accept estimated revenue in the amount of $46,307 in Federal Department of Justice support for youth violence prevention, broader urban involvement, and leadership development program. Then there's a series of construction projects related to Transportation and Public Works Department or Committee, Johnson Street Northeast, Burroughs North area, and DuPont Avenue South, street resurfacing special assessment cancellation, sidewalk repair special assessment cancellation, Nicollet Central Modern Streetcar Project authorizing staff to submit an application for a Tiger 2014 grant to implement the Nicollet Central Modern Streetcar Project, and authorizing transfer of $76,607 from Solid Waste Fund to the General Fund to fund a policy position in the Mayor's Office for a Zero Waste Initiative, and then accepting of 3 bids for some various construction projects. One is a low bid with Fisher Mining a single bid with Graymont, and a single bid for Commercial Asphalt Company. And then approving a resolution increasing the Transportation, Maintenance, and Repair Division's General Fund appropriation in the amount of $1 million from the contingency fund for the purpose of providing additional resources to perform an accelerated level of pothole patching. And then there's a number of actions related to Cedar Avenue Sidewalk Modifications Project, amending the 2014 adopted capital budget to establish Cedar Avenue sidewalk modifications with the following revenue sources outlined in the report. And then I think that concludes our consent items. Are there any questions from committee members or anything like additional items to discuss? Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to make a comment on item number 16.
Please do.
The Zero Waste Initiative. I really want to thank Mayor Hodges for working to create this policy position. I think it is excellent and needed, and it's something that I know all the folks on this committee are passionate about, and my colleagues are passionate about zero waste as well. And so I really want to thank her for taking this step. It's exciting to see the efforts coming from her office.
Okay, thank you for that comment. Anything? Yes, Councilmember Yang.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have two questions, one on item number 2 and one on item number 4. For item number 2, my question is, with regards to this, I guess, this agreement between the city of Minneapolis and Gene Thorne, are these union jobs that we're talking about, or is it just temporary?
As I understand it, it's as-needed administrative clerical assistance for the city attorney's office. I don't know if they're represented in the union, but perhaps Mr. Ginder could clarify.
Mr. Chair, these are temporary positions that are being filled right now, and the city attorney's office is in the process of trying to fill permanent positions. We've changed and upgraded some positions, and but the point is we're moving forward and trying to fill those positions on a permanent basis. But this is a person that's been here temporarily, and we need to extend it for a little bit longer.
Okay.
Thank you.
And
additional?
Yeah, the question for number 4, this is, an amount of $230,000 plus, and I'm wondering if this is specifically for human resources, or is this to develop a leadership development program for the whole of the city of Minneapolis?
Thank you, Councilmember. Mr. Carpenter, if you could help us with that, or somebody from the city coordinator's office.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Yang, yes, it's for the entire city. It's a consulting firm that the HR department has worked with to do some pilot work on a broader leadership development work. And this is to take that work and actually, we've sort of scoped out what we want to do. This is put some nuts and bolts operational parameters around it. And my colleague and friend
Has made an entrance just on this cue.
Ms. Ferguson can explain more detail, but it is meant to be enterprise-wide, and we'll set up something we used to do in the city that we haven't done for a long time, which is spend time and energy developing leaders.
And this was, we did spend some time in last year's budget discussing this position, revisiting it, putting it back on scope. So if Ms. Ferguson, if you'd like to comment on it, you're welcome to.
I think my most esteemed colleague.
You guys met,
It's
right?
not, this is enterprise-wide, and this is spanning over the course of 2014 and 2015. And that's what Kevin said is very much appropriate. It's not for the Human Resources Department. And we have a team right now that's enterprise-wide that's actually working to help with the design.
Thank you. I felt like that brief moment we were back in, the British parliamentary system with those nice little comments. But yes, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Any other questions? Okay, I'd like to move all those items on the consent agenda. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And opposed? Those items carry. And that gets us to the star of the show for several discussion items. This is the fourth quarter financial status report. And I invite Mr. Carpenter to introduce the topic and our guest speaker. How about that, Ms. Griffith?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I also want to frame up this fourth quarter discussion in the context of the set of conversations that we are planning to bring before this committee about financial topics in general. Today, we are focusing on debt after we get done with the fourth quarter report. And let me just say a couple of things about both of these initiatives, if you will. Working with Chair Quincy and Vice Chair of this committee, Glidden, we thought it would be a really good move as we are working with new policymakers or policymakers who are in different roles to make sure everyone was starting from a common understanding on some of these fundamental financial management topics. So we've developed, in conjunction with Council Members Quincy and Glidden, this series of what we're going to call educational sessions over the next few Ways and Means cycles to ground people in some of the basic truths about how the city operates financially. So you will note on your agenda that in 2 weeks we intend to talk about city revenue, which will incorporate some concepts around fees. Then we will talk about property taxes, not just from a financial perspective, but from the actions you take here and how does that impact individual residents and all the different moving parts that go into that. Then we'll talk about city expenditures. And importantly, in this, developing this pathway, I wanted to just reiterate something that I feel often gets lost in the shuffle, is that when we are talking about the city as an enterprise, we are talking about way more than the general fund. And all of these topics come together under the rubric of financial management and budgets. You know, the general fund is plus or minus 400 million, and our total city budget is $1.2 billion or $1.3 billion. And they do work in concert. So throughout these discussions, I just wanted to set that, we're trying to make some linkages between all those. Also, just point out that one of our objectives in all of these discussions, whether it's fourth quarter report or about debt or these coming discussions, is to give you enough of the taste of the details to feel confident that you understand, or understand enough or know where to go with questions, but we aren't going to answer every detailed question in this journey. We're hoping to provide a framework for ongoing financial decisions, which frankly is about a lot more than budget. If we are presuming that budget management and financial management are equivalent, we have challenges. We do budgets once a year, and then we take actions along the way to make sure we are good stewards of the financial resources. So throughout this, we'll be trying to mix, and I'm sure we won't be completely successful, sort of the right level of detail with the right level of context for decision making. And before we get into this, I just wanted to set those parameters and make sure you all know too that my staff and others throughout the city are of course available for questions and deeper dives on any topic should you so desire. So with that, what we thought made great sense, if you really want to know where the starting place is, the best starting place financially is to figure out where we were at the end of 2013, which we do through the fourth quarter report, which will be provided by Ms. Connie Griffith, our city controller, Mary Dunning, the Director of Financial Reporting and Accounting. Close. Connie's right-hand person has a huge role on her staff in preparing this information. Then when Connie's done, I'll get back up and talk about debt, and we'll go from there.
Very good. Thank you very much, Mr. Carpenter. Ms. Griffith, you're welcome to join us. Launch into this broad topic, but I think that Mr. Carpenter framed it well. We're not looking for individual line item kinds of question kind of ideas. Those kind of things can be brought offline and provided a lot more detail as people need them, but this does kind of structure the whole conversation. So off we go.
Councilmember Quincy and members of the committee, my name is Connie Griffith. I am the controller for the city. I have prepared for today the financial status report on the fourth quarter 2013 and would like to provide a couple caveats to this report. One, it is based on the fourth quarter information unaudited. We are still in the process of being audited and preparing our comprehensive annual financial report. And as such, we may have some audit adjustments that might change some of the numbers. The other part about this is I am focused primarily on the last 2 pages of the report that you received, which is the schedule of showing the financial status of all of the funds, mostly the cash and fund balance or cash and net position. And those would be the area where you can focus on, I think, a little bit, and we'll get some of the information from this report. First, what I thought I would go through is each of the fund areas and then do a little summary at the end about our particular status at this time. As usual, we have continued to show growth every year in all of the funds, and in particular the general fund. Over the last 5 years, since 2010, we've had in fund balance roughly a 14 to 15% increase each year. Our fund balance currently is $96.3 million. This is an $11 million increase over 2012. And it is primarily due to 3 things. One is the $9.7 million increase in or revenues exceeding budget for the year. And these revenues, the primary revenues that come into the general fund, which is, as by its name, a general fund, it is used to account for all financial resources except those that are required to be accounted for elsewhere. So that's a pretty general definition. And the primary revenues that we have in this fund, of course, are the property taxes, which make up 44%. And then you have 3 others, the state aids, which are things like the local government aids and the MSA, those types of, so the state aids, and the charges for services, which are things like the utility cut revenue that we get from Public Works, things like that. And then we have our license and permit fees, which is another large. And all 4 of these make up about 89% of the revenue source for the general fund. So what caused the $9.7 million increase over what we had expected in the budget planning was property taxes, which came in higher than expected, both from the increased delinquent collections of for taxes and also at the excess TIF collections. We also had in licenses and permits a huge increase that just continued to be shown every year and quarter because of the ongoing construction and economic activity in the city that makes that go up each year. And then also our franchise fees, and the franchise fees primarily in the electric and cable franchise fees added to the $9.7 million. The other part about that caused our $11 million increase was the $3.9 million that came from the under expenditure of expense appropriations by the departments within the general fund. And this was offset by, of course, we had a rollover from last year of $2.4 million. So that reduces that, because we've increased our budget, it reduces the amount that is actually due to the under expenditure of expenses.
Excuse me, Ms. Griffith?
Yes.
Real quick, when you say rollover from last year, do you mean 2012 or 2000?
I'm sorry, yes.
I just want to
we
make
have-
sure we're saying last year is actually the year before,
Yeah.
for everybody's context.
You usually have 2 to 3 years that you're talking about when you're talking about accounting and financial reporting, so that is a good clarification. Thank you. And in this case, all the departments came in either under or at the adjusted budget that we ended up with at the end of the year. And most of the under expenditure was due to vacancy savings. And in the case of a couple of entities, Public Works in particular always exceeds its expenditure in the snow area, the recovery. But their overall budget for the department, they always are well within what they need to spend. So that was one there. The coordinator's office had a $1 million under expenditure, primarily again to vacancy savings, primarily in the human resources department. And then finally, police and fire both had received contingency appropriation at the end of the year because they anticipated going over their budgets due to unexpected vehicle and equipment costs. And what happened was they were both able to create their own savings and to underspend either through vacancies or some other savings that they were able to come up with. And as a result, neither one used the contingency that was given to them. So that was beneficial, and that was a good thing on their part that they were able to do that.
Excuse me just one second, Ms. Griffith. Councilmember Glidden, if you had a question, feel free to jump.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to go back and note, you talked about these revenues, and a very significant source of the exceeding budget part of the revenues was the license and permit fees. And so I had a question and then a comment for my colleagues, and I guess the comment for my colleagues is that the finance department has been undergoing for a significant amount of time now a very large report that I don't know when in recent memory there has been a report of this type to help assess fees, which would include fines because they're administrative expenses and other things. And then we'll be presenting this to the city council and probably will prompt some policy discussion too about the right sizing of fees and other things like that potentially. Just as a marker to folks, it's a very significant report because it has to look at what are direct and indirect costs and all sorts of things that go into what does that fee actually pay for. But of the excess fees and permits, do you have any sense how much of that is due to the fact we have a lot of construction happening versus other types of economic activity around restaurants or other kinds of business?
Councilmember Quincy and Councilmember Glidden, I cannot tell you what part of that would be. We consider it primarily to be the construction activity because that continues to increase and continue. At the same time, one of the issues with the fees is that part of the excess might be that we are underestimating what we expect to receive in that because it is difficult to pinpoint how much that might be. And I think that might be part of the issue in talking about right sizing and talking about making sure we are charging the right amount. That's one of the factors. The other factor with those particular licenses and permit fees is that the expenditures associated with them come after the fee is collected, the inspections and that type of activity. So it's not necessarily, it can also be a timing difference in that we get the revenues in, but we haven't incurred all of the expenses yet.
Right. And these, what Councilmember Glidden is pointing out is on page 2 of the attached report, not of the presentation. And it does really point to the complexity of budgeting. I mean, these fees that were put in the budget at a percent or at a dollar amount were put in at the end of 2012, and we experienced collection of those fees in 2013, and that's what's being reported here. But as you just alluded to, some of those expenses that are going to match with those inspection fees, for example, are going to actually occur in 2014. Is that right?
Correct.
And of course, we have some big projects underway downtown East, the stadium, yet to be realized. But that's a fascinating point to point out.
I would like to continue with a little talk about the cash balance, which also continues to climb at the same rate as the fund balance. In the general fund, the fund balance is primarily cash and is generally what we call unassigned. There isn't any restrictions put on that at this point in time, although that may change as we become more able to look at what we need to do with that and what we want to do with it into the future. So there aren't any restrictions at this time. The cash balance is $101.5 million at the end of the year. That was a $14.7 million increase over 2012. And what I noted in here, in order to bring it down to what the fund balance is, that obviously we have $5.2 million in obligations exceeding our receivables at the year end. So that's primarily the difference between the fund balance and cash. Usually general fund cash and fund balance are about the same amount. In looking at both our cash and fund balance in the general fund, I think what we want to look at is that even though it appears to be a lot of money, it is not available. It's used to meet reserve requirements. We have in the general fund a fairly significant reserve requirement. It helps us provide flexibility for the general fund. It's something that the rating agencies for bonds look for because they want to make sure that we're maintaining our stability, financial stability, and so we have changed our reserve requirement for the general fund. It used to be 15% of the next year's budgeted revenues. We have changed it to 17% of the next year's budgeted expenditures. So it provides us with a number that is a little more favorable for the rating agencies in particular, and for us in providing comfort about the stability of the fund.
I imagine you probably get to that a little bit more when you talk about debt and the importance of rating agencies and their comfort level of cash on hand and ability to pay.
Having a reserve in this fund and any of the funds allows us some flexibility to handle those things that we don't anticipate happening. This happened in 2010. It's 2010 or 11. I've just been here since 2011. When the LGA came in significantly less than what we expected by like $20 million. And as a result, we had to fill in, and we were able to do that because we had this kind of reserve and we had this kind of stability. So
I just do want to point out, when you said we're changing, you're talking about changes in our financial policy that the council establishes.
Correct.
You and Kevin just aren't in the back room cooking up some numbers. Hey, let's change the idea, right?
thank you, Councilmember Quincy. That helps.
We do
Yeah, we're
that too.
doing that too,
I don't want to hear that. No. Go ahead.
The other thing that we also include in here, we have planned uses for this fund balance, especially in order to help us provide over the next 5 years some kind of sustainability and to enable us to continue to support the city as it needs to be supported. And so we get into our rollover that we did from 2013 to 2014, which was $1.7 million. We have the budget for 2014, which includes a number of one-time programs and costs that we are incurring in order to help us for the future have fewer costs to deal with in the future. And a lot of the planning is what we benefit from in this kind of how we set up our budget and everything. Our property tax reduction that we have this year, the levy is down 1%, so that also takes away from what we anticipate collecting. And then we had a new program, our CARS, which is the Capital Asset Request System, which provides for funding of our technology programs and some of the equipment and other capital costs that we're incurring that we had not planned for in the past. And this, again, all of this is using strategy and planning and making sure that we're using these dollars to help move us into the future at a lower cost.
I'd just like to expand a little bit more on the CARS program. I think it was an incredibly important strategic financial management tool that was implemented a few years ago. And I think we saw that reflected in this year's report, especially when you're talking about fire and police. A lot of that was in fleet services. And if we were not adequately anticipating those capital costs over a period of time, a department would have to change what they spend or what they fall short on in a year, and make it very hard to recuperate. So that hard to capture. But the CARS program has been an incredibly valuable tool.
Thank
Please
you.
continue.
The next fund that we're going to talk about is the special revenue funds, and these are a number of funds in this area. They're used to account for and report the proceeds of specific revenue sources that are restricted or committed to expenditures for specified purposes. And so we have a number of special revenue funds. We have the Convention Center, the Target Center, all of our grant funds are in this area, the Community Planning and Economic Development special revenue funds. We also have a number of them that we usually don't report on because they're not as major or significant. But they include some of the fees we get for police activity, some of the fines and forfeits that we get there get accounted for here because they have to be used for specific purposes. We have the nuisance abatement housing in regulatory services and police, and we have the employee retirement funds that are the left over from all of the previous retirement systems that we had that have closed out. These types of things that are accounted for specific purposes and specific revenues. So that's what's included in there. Our fund balance at the year end for all of these funds was $311.9 million. That was a $10 million increase over 2012. So there isn't as significant a change from year to year. The Convention Center operations were significantly improved this year. They had sort of a banner year as far as their operating revenue rather than having to depend on the state and local taxes. But they also account for the state and local taxes, the sales tax, the lodging tax, entertainment, or not entertainment, but the alcohol tax. Those types of things are all included in the Convention Center for 2013. In 2014, they have been moved to the general fund because they are general fund revenues, and the gap between the operating revenues that they bring in and what they need to continue their whole operation, and that will be funded through a transfer from the general fund. They're also included in here was the Target Center operations, which improved, and the employee retirement funds, which also improved significantly. So both of these, or all three of these, added to the increases in both fund balance and cash in these funds. The cash is $245.4 million. Most of that cash is in the Community Planning and Economic Development, or CPED, development funds. That's takes up $175 million of that cash. So there isn't a lot of change from year to year in that, but it is the biggest amount of that cash. The next funds are the internal service funds. Internal service funds are all those funds that account for what we call goods and services provided internally to other government units. So they include things like the engineering materials and testing lab, the fleet services, property services, central stores, and the IT and self-insurance fund. So all of these provide services. They develop cost recovery models for each of these. They actually charge all of the other departments, primarily in the governmental and general fund area. And what they end up with over the years has been some difficulty in sustaining viable fund balances and cash balances. And as a result, some years ago, they developed some workout plans for these entities, and we've been operating within these workout plans to either provide funding or cash to each of these internal service funds so that they can continue to operate. What's happened in the last few years is they have significantly improved in both their fund balance and cash positions, and consequently, we're anticipating that at the end of this year, they will no longer need to have workout plans and operate within that, and we anticipate that that will be done. And if you look at the schedule, you can see where they've each come up and are doing much better than where they were a few years ago even. So.
Okay, well, Councilmember Yang, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Quick question. I mean, the self-insurance fund, I mean, is that kind of like a malpractice fund for anybody in the city that we might have to indemnify? Is that kind of my understanding what it is, or?
Councilmember Quincy, Councilmember Yang, no, that is, the self-insurance fund has all of our, that's where we account for all of our, like our medical and that type of thing, our benefits that we deal with. But it is also where we have our unemployment insurance, we have our workers' compensation, we have from the city attorney's office, I think when we have claims and that type of thing, go through that fund. So it covers a whole gamut of activity, and the biggest thing there is making sure that we're covering the liability that's the incurred but not reported liability that might be out there. So we do have an actuarial study done each year of that fund. But the biggest thing about that is to maintain the cash balance that we have in there and to have that grow to provide the flexibility to handle sort of the uncertainty.
Right.
Okay. The next fund that we deal with is the enterprise funds. And the enterprise funds do the same thing as the internal service fund in that they provide goods and services but to external parties. So our primary enterprise funds are our utility operations, the solid waste operations, and the municipal parking fund. And in this case, they all have fairly strong fund balances and also cash balances in order to, again, provide flexibility and the ability to make decisions as to how they want to fund the huge amount of infrastructure expenses that they're going to occur in the future. So they've all been building up their cash balances for that purposes. Their year-end fund balance was $868.8 million. This was an increase of $33 million over 2012. And again, the reason their fund balance is so high is primarily because of the infrastructure assets that they have in their fund balance. Their cash at the year end was $111.8 million. This was an increase of $3.7 million. What they've started using is their cash balances to pay for some of this infrastructure maintenance and repair. Particularly in the solid waste area, because they implemented the one sort program and the change in their recycling fee that they charge. It used to be that they would give a credit for the recycling, and instead they turned that around this last year, and in that transition year had planned on using fund balance to cover some of their costs of operation until they could get a better idea of what that was. Also in this 2013, they incurred a lot of their equipment costs and that to provide for that one sort recycling because they needed new carts and that type of thing. The other area that seems to do really well at this point in time is the municipal parking fund. And the one thing that's making a difference in their revenues is this on-street parking change that they made with all the new meters and everything. People are more inclined to use those, and as a result, they've had a significant increase in their revenues from that program. So that has really helped that fund.
Yeah, I'd just like to point out, in both of those examples, and they're excellent examples, are examples of great cash management and operations that in having a fund balance enabled them to make investments instead of going into debt to buy new parking meters. We were able to use this existing fund strategy as a way to pay for this, and it has paid itself off instead of going into long-term debt. Same thing with the implementation of the one-sort recycling, something we all wanted to do, of course, but we wouldn't have been able to do that without the operations savings over time. and making those big changes and adjustments into how we operate. So terrific programs.
Thank you, Councilmember Quincy. That is their intent, and they all have spent a lot of time in planning each year how they need to move forward. And I know that stormwater in particular is anticipating a significant amount of cost in the future to cover all the maintenance that they have to do of their whole system. So the final slide is an overview and summary. As you can see, the city as a whole continues to experience very positive and stable financial growth. And this has a lot to say about both council and finance and the city making the planned decisions that it has, and being planful and strategic and thinking not just of the current year, but of the next 5 years and beyond, how they want to grow and how we need to establish our finances and our budget. The overall cash position at the year end, and this is kind of an interesting number, it's $689.6 million. This is an increase of $95.2 million over, or 16% over 2012. The situation is, if you look at my sheet, the spreadsheet, is that the cash up through 2012 is cash balances on the base of the comprehensive annual financial report. And that's a little different than the cash that's actually in the bank and being invested because of the float, the amount that we've expensed on our books, but has not actually gone through the investment and actually been spent. So there is a little bit of difference. Most of the balance in the $689 million is non-spendable or restricted, committed, or assigned. And this is all having to do with the different types of funds and what you can use the money for in those funds and the cash in those funds. So that's, it's an accounting thing, all these labels, but it also is an indication that there isn't just money to be spent willy-nilly, I guess, without doing some planning and thinking about what you want to do with that. So with that growth in cash balances, I think we want to reflect once again and summarize that one of the important things in all of these funds is that we're meeting our reserves and minimum requirements just to enable us to have the flexibility we need to be able to make decisions when things come up that weren't planned for or weren't anticipated, that we have flexibility to make decisions for things like $1 million for pothole repair or things that we hadn't anticipated, but that we know needs to be done in order to make the city a viable city. There are plan uses. Again, we will have rollovers every year where things meet the criteria for the rollovers, and that's the decision that we need to make. That there's budget changes and there's one-time projects and programs that are coming up that we need to be flexible and able to address those one-time things. And again, for the enterprise funds and throughout is the capital asset and capital infrastructure expending that we need to make. Otherwise, we are doing very well, and I always enjoy presenting this because I know it's a positive report.
It's a good news report.
Thank you.
Were there any comments or questions from Ms. Griffith? Great. Thank you very much. I'm sure there'll be more as we, all these kind of reports, especially when you talk about schedules and big, thick pieces of paper, always lead to more questions than answers, but gives us an opportunity to digest that information and come back to you. Mr. Carpenter, you've got some fun news to share?
Mr. Chair, yes, I believe I do.
Yeah,
Members
that's
of the
great.
committee. It's not totally by accident that we paired an introduction to debt with a fourth quarter financial report that was robust. Because in many ways, I believe that sort of debt signals the importance of planning and strategies in a very different way than annual operating decisions. At their essence, many annual operating decisions can be tweaked, if not reversed, every year. Once I enter into debt, we have committed the city in different ways to a stream of repayments. Flipping back for a second just to Ms. Griffith's presentation, when she threw all those accounting words like non-spendable, committed, one thing to sort of sort through is that the parameters under which those labels are attached vary by activity and are to different degrees reversible based on either accounting principles changing, legislation changing, or policy decisions. So it points out in a different way how financial management is anything but static. It's a dynamic equation. Within that, when we issue debt, we're fixing some set of our obligations. So it's an important tool to understand when we use it, why we use it, and how we balance its use. I will also point out through this discussion, we may be referring in different ways to the chart that Ms. Griffith was talking about in the fourth quarter report, I think is on page 64 and 5. It's a new sort of template. It's called a financial strength analysis, but it gives you a trend analysis of certain of the categories of resources that have been in the city's financial statements. Before I start with that, I also wanted to introduce some colleagues that are critical to the city's appropriate stewardship of this awesome resource and this awesome tool. Bruce Plant, who many of you know is the city treasurer, and through the financial strength analysis, that is very much focused on cash and fund balance, which at its essence is a balance sheet measure as opposed to an income or operating statement measure. And that is in many ways the intersection between the controller's office, the budget office, and the treasurer's office, the balance sheet. Secondly, we have from Kennedy and Graven, John Utley and Julie Eddington. They have served as the city's general obligation bond counsel for a number of years, and we recently, through an RFP process, selected them again for a 3-year period going forward to serve as the city's general obligation bond counsel. When we get into some of this detail, you will see, or some of the information we provided, issuing bonds is an intensely legal experience as well as a financial one, and we are really pleased to have Kennedy and Graven on board for another 3 years. They've been wonderful partners as we've gone through this journey. What are we talking about here? What is a debt obligation? What is a bond? Very simply, a lender's giving us cash now, and we're promising to repay them with interest over time. It is, in essence, the way we talk about bond or bonds, it's a form of a loan, but it isn't. It is a loan in essence. The difference between what we talk about bonds versus loans, loans are like your mortgage. They give you money now and you promise to repay over time. But there's usually one maturity date and one interest rate. Bonds, the way the city and local and state governments, is really a series of loans done at one time. So it allows you to issue bonds where they have different maturity dates and therefore different interest rates at one time with same other characteristics, but it's really just a package of individual loans. Why do we issue debt? If we have to pay interest, it's in theory expensive as opposed to using our cash. It is a way to preserve cash for flexibility. It is also so that we can do large infusions of cash to do capital projects. The classic example is big bridges or a set of repaving exercises. It also, however, provides, in certain circumstances, an ability to do one-time cash infusions to things you might think of as operations. If we owe $25 million to fund our pension plan, if we chose to, we can bond for that and find the source of cash from the bonding markets. Technology, rolling stock, i.e. fleet, and they are all eligible to be bonded for, so are judgments. So in certain circumstances, you can use bonds for those things. It is also a source of cash that we lend to private or nonprofit partners to finance their projects. Finance is in italics for very important reasons, to differentiate it from funding. There's a lot of discussion when we did the Downtown East example about how we were financing that transaction, not funding it, because we set in motion we were going to receive money from doing the project that covered our debt service expense. It's similar to how we will be doing Target Center for at least part of that obligation. The Timberwolves, or the team, and AEG will both be providing money for their share of the project. We, however, are going to be the finance agent for each of those private entities for some reasons that we can get into later. It's also true that we do this extensively for smaller nonprofit partners who may not be able to access the capital markets, or even large ones, large hospital systems. This is largely known, as we'll get into a little bit later, as conduit financing, which the city is an active player in.
Just also, as we speak about conduit financing, it's also a business line of our city.
Yes.
We make money at some of these projects.
Mr. Chair, yes, that is correct. We collect revenue from the issuance of conduit bonds.
Right. And being a city, we have the ability to issue these kind of bonds, whereas when a hospital wanted to be built, Children's, they wouldn't have had access to that kind of money. We have the access because we can issue the bond.
Mr. Chair, that is correct. In general, there's a couple of different ways to slice our debt portfolio. On this slide, what I tried to do in the first set, the types of city bonds, those are bonds where city financial resources are at stake. And there's basically four kinds within that. There are general obligation tax-backed bonds. Generally, these are financing what I would call bread and butter improvements, so roads, bridges, some of those things, where we actually go through an exercise or annually levying property taxes to provide the revenue to pay back the bonds that we issued to create the cash to build the project. At the current time, or as of 3/31, we had approximately $160 million of that category of bonds outstanding. Second category is also general obligation, but those are what we would refer to as revenue-backed general obligation bonds. Now, what that really means is we've planned for a discrete revenue stream to cover the debt service, the annual payments of principal and interest that come with issuing the bonds, but we are also promising to the lender, or lenders if it's a capital markets transaction, to, if necessary, levy property taxes. For as long as I've been here, and I suspect well before my tenure, I don't know that we've ever levied taxes for a revenue-backed GO bond. There are resources available through the planning process to take those revenues or supplement in a one-time basis other revenues before we levy taxes. However, they are still deemed general obligation bonds. Why do we do that? Because with that pledge behind it, it's really an insurance policy to the investor, and we can issue those bonds at a much lower rate than we could if we only pledged to use a dedicated stream of revenue. Right? So most of our general obligation parking revenue bonds, the intent and the plan and the practice is we use parking revenues to pay that back. Utility, we do geo water bonds. That's paid by the rates that are paid by consumers of the water. Assessment bonds, sales tax bonds, all wrapped with a geo. And as you'll see here, that is the lion's share of our general obligation debt, $630 million outstanding as of 3/31. From a rating agency perspective and a financial management perspective and an investor perspective, they think about those very differently than the tax base. Because you aren't committing, although you're committing to levy the pledge if you need to, for all intents and purposes, it doesn't affect the tax base. So that is a second category. Third category are real revenue bonds, where we don't pledge the city's taxing power. We use that very sparingly. We have about 25 million outstanding now, and currently the only kind of city debt we have that is pure revenue is some tax increment revenue bonds, as opposed to pay-as-you-go TIF notes. So there's only about 25 million of that. And the last category where city financial resources are at stake is this unique vehicle called the Common Bond Fund. About approximately 95 million outstanding of that. That is a real specialized structured financing vehicle for economic development projects. The bonds that are issued are secured by lease payments by the entity that's in effect occupying a new facility. There are some additional reserves in the city's coffers that are pledged should the lease payments be insufficient. And in an absolute disaster scenario, the city is also, on a very limited basis, pledging to levy taxes to cover the debt service on those. It's capped at an amount. That's why it's a limited pledge. It's not an unlimited general obligation pledge. But it is, because of those additional reserves and limited city pledges, it is a city resource at stake. So you add those four categories together, it's about $910 million of city debt outstanding where there are financial resources involved.
Mr. Carpenter, I wondered if you could tell me about the terms of that debt. How long will that debt be carried?
Mr. Chair, it varies, of course. It varies in categories. It varies by project within a category. For example, the Common Bond Fund financings, we would most likely finance the debt as long as the lease obligation existed. So we would match the lease payments coming in with the debt service going out. For other capital projects, we generally try and keep it as short as possible because it is generally cheaper. The shorter you go, and we'll get into some of that in a second. At the same time, we don't want to put too much a burden on either the revenue source or the pledge, so we're balancing that, and generally you want to finance assets in some relationship to their economic life,
right?
So that you aren't
Some
paying
of these,
for the asset continually while it's no longer useful, and you have to invest cash into it to make it extend its useful life.
yeah. So sometimes a 10-year, 20, 30.
Yeah, we would never, in fact, we're probably not even statutorily allowed to go longer than 30, I don't. The vast majority of our portfolio is inside 20 years when issued, and the vast majority of that is probably inside 10.
And of the 910 million that you identified here as outstanding city debt, how does that number of 910 compare to, say, 5 years ago, more or less?
It is less. We have had a steady downward trend for the last few years as we've built up some financial resources and tried to streamline our financial operation. It is higher than it was at the end of 2013 because of Downtown East, and it is likely to be higher than this at the end of 2014 as we do things like Target Center and our regular debt issuance. It is a delicate balancing act as to what the right number is. As long as you are, as we will get into that a little bit later, if you are able to make good investments and demonstrate good financial stewardship, and this is a way to move the enterprise that is the city forward, I would say it's a extremely important and valuable. It is just as bad from a financial management standpoint, I believe, to be underinvested in debt as it is to be over.
Right. So there's no magic number?
No magic number.
But
This is,
910 is
5
not-
years ago, we were about, I think, $1.4 billion. So we cut it down to 910 from that. That would have been its high water mark.
Thank you.
The other category at the bottom here, which I called other city issuance, which does not involve city financial resources, is this bucket of conduit issuance. We issue the bonds, and we lend the money to a nonprofit entity, anywhere from a De La Salle Academy to Fairview, and they are responsible for repaying the debt obligation. So the city is not on the hook financially at all. We have approximately $2.4 billion of conduit bonds. City of Minneapolis issues. The lion's share of that is with Fairview and Alina and Health Partners and Children's Hospital. There are over 100 separate bond issuances in that category. And while we have no repayment obligation, and this is more true now than it has been over the last few years, there are an ever-evolving set of legal, compliance, IRS, securities laws that we are part of because we are the issuer of these bonds. And it does take some time and energy from staff, too, in both finance and primarily CPED. But
Thank you. Councilmember Glidden, please.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I just had a couple questions about the conduit borrowings. And you already talked about there is an administrative fee that's paid for staff time in putting together the issuance. Is there, I just want to know, is there any criteria that the city utilizes to issue conduit borrowings other than the entity as a qualifying nonprofit entity? And my other question is, are these administratively approved and issued, or do they, because I remember one that was a hospital, did come through the city council process, but I can't remember if it was because it was a conduit borrowing or maybe for some other reasons related to the project. So just curious about how these go through the city process today.
let me answer that question first, and then you'll have to remind me what the first one was. All conduit issuances are issued pursuant to resolutions that are adopted by the council. For the most part, they flow through the CD committee and then get to full committee, but there is a rigorous legal component that because we are the issuer, we still have to comply with both state statutory guidance as well as IRS regs that govern, in certain cases, the issuance of conduit bonds. Kennedy and Graven is on our panel of bond counsels that work on conduit issues along with other local law firms. So if we get there, if you have specific questions, Mr. Utley or Ms. Eddington can go there. To your first question about the criteria we use as to how to do that, we are working on continuing to better understand that process. It, for the most part, because it doesn't involve financial risk to the city, is not something that we're involved in making pure underwriting decisions, for example. We aren't lending, although we technically are lending the money, the obligation to repay it to the bondholder is the borrower's obligation. So we have to comply with certain tax rules. There's limited quantity of, depending on what kind of bonding you're looking at, of authority to issue, say, housing revenue conduit bonds is governed by allocations of what's called bonding cap from first the feds, then to the states. And there are other tax rules that play in. So,
okay, so, and that wasn't right. So, and I would assume there are some criteria that maybe is more on the technical side that was a little different than the intent of my question, which I think you also answered. You're sort of discussing that, but My other question may be, so what I'm hearing is that there's a resolution that we do, which I'm assuming is more about ensuring that the entity meets these qualifying criteria that are more about can it repay the bond and meets other types of criteria. It's a nonprofit entity. And then my last question may answer part of this filtering of what kind of entity would want the conduit borrowing versus getting lending from another source? Because I have to assume there's, some benefit, but may not flow to just every type of project you may want that requires some sort of lending. Otherwise, we'd see a lot more of these.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Glidden, it's really a hodgepodge, if I may use that technical term. In addition to the resolution, the city is also a party to a significant number of the underlying operative documents. There is a loan agreement between the city and the borrower that outlines roles and responsibilities. So we do have some responsibility to oversee terms and conditions.
But what's the benefit to the borrower?
The benefit to the borrower is usually one of two things. In a case like Fairview, which has clearly got its own credit, can do that, they don't have access under the tax rules to tax-exempt financing like we do. So we are, in effect, renting our tax exemption to them. That's the basic thing. On the smaller issuers, the De La Salles and all that, it is generally true that what we provide there is a process and a access to lenders that they may not have on the same terms as they have because we are their umbrella. So we can sort of play marriage broker, if you will. Not that we do in a formal sense. We aren't taking an obligation for the lender is making the independent credit decision, but we can grease the skids. And we also provide again, especially since this is all tax exemption, it is the way to get access to the authority under the statutes and IRS regs for tax exempt financing.
What about the rates themselves? That they would be paying interest would be a
Rates
lower
that they
rate
would
than
pay,
the bank.
whether they're doing, many of these deals are small, what are called privately done deals, direct to a lender. Some are done through the capital markets. They will all be based on the creditworthiness of the borrower. The city being the issuer does not affect the lender's determination of what they will charge the borrower for the money that they are giving them.
Thank you. I'm sure you're going to get to the term, but is debt capacity in this, or do we have a capacity issue of how much we can issue through these instruments?
In conduits?
Yes.
Not in a macro sense. We are subject every year to some of these regulatory and tax rules about how much housing revenue bond allocation is out there, or there's a special $10 million small issue exception, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a annual, year-by-year question and driven by tax rules, not a debt capacity from how much can you afford to take on.
Okay.
Rating agencies do not look at conduits when they are assessing the cities. Doesn't mean you don't get calls about them, because if something happens and it's a public rated transaction issued by the city, the first call is usually to my office.
Okay.
Very, very briefly, just wanted to touch on tax exempt versus taxable for a couple of reasons. One, generally speaking, and there's the IRS regs regarding this are fairly substantial, as you might imagine. But when we issue bonds for what is generally a public purpose, the interest earned by the holder of that bond is exempt from taxation. That benefits us because it allows us to borrow at a lower borrowing cost, because the holder is getting a tax break in effect. So They might lend money to a corporation at 5% because they have to pay tax on the interest they would get for that loan, but they might lend it to us for 4% because the entire 4% would be tax-free to them. There are certain situations where bond proceeds get used for what is deemed under the tax code a private purpose, and the interest then becomes taxable. That is probably 95% of the regs that are out there about tax exemption all have to do with this differentiation between public and private purpose. There's things called private activity tests, private use tests, etc. Generally speaking, the clean, simple public purpose, streets, public buildings, tax exempt all the way. You get into potential private uses, even for facilities that have public ownership or public benefit, to the extent that the use and the beneficiaries are private parties above certain criteria. So for example, when we do Target Center, because some of the benefit of doing that financing will accrue to the private entity known as the teams, the Timberwolves and Lynx, that issue will be taxable. It makes sense for the team, however, to use us as their financing agent, not their funding agent, because even on a taxable basis, because our credit is so good, it is a cheaper method for the overall project to be financed using our credit wrapped with a general obligation rather than the Timberwolves going to their local bank and getting charged multiples of what the capital markets will charge for our credit. Now, part of the reason I went to that is we are more than willing, so we are lowering financing costs in an overall project that we have a stake in, but we are also maintaining security beyond their promise to pay, for example, using the Timberwolves, to make sure that we aren't at risk for just doling out our good credit without standards. We will never go into those situations without significant discussion around collateral and around security for the kinds of payments that need to come from the private parties to enable them to access our good credit. We work too hard to get it. We aren't going to give it away willy-nilly.
It's twice willy-nilly's been used. I'd just like to point that out.
It is also true that many of the things we might think of as public purpose become taxable because of how they use it. Well, at the end of last year, for example, we did actually 5 series of bonds issues at the same time, 2 of which were taxable. That's the cover of the offering document. The $7 million taxable general obligation various purpose park bonds, that was to finance the improvements at Parade Ice Garden. That's taxable because of some of the underlying arrangements about access to that facility, which goes to youth hockey or figure skating or other entities that don't meet for tax purposes the definitions that would enable us to issue those bonds tax exempt. Mm-hmm. So even in this, it's a very detailed and situational analysis that keeps Messrs. Utley and Eddington employed over time, among other things. To your questions earlier, Councilmember Glidden, how do we do it? How do we issue bonds? It all starts with resolutions in terms of the council's formal actions. I shared in the information the resolution that was the underlying premise for the Downtown East financing. It is, as you will note, 18 pages long. That is a particularly long one. They vary in some direct proportion to the uniqueness and complexity of the transaction in terms of the length of the resolution. In it, the authority is granted for us pursuant to different state statutes to go ahead and issue bonds that, and then execute the underlying financial documents required to give us the confidence that we can actually repay those bonds. So it starts with resolutions. It starts with resolutions no matter what the project and no matter whether it's any of those 4 city resources at stake or conduits. The second phase of bond issuance, and again, this varies a lot based on the type of project you're doing, is really about the underlying financial documentation and contracts, which, as my example, I'm using this bottom set of documents from the Downtown East transaction, which provided things like a development agreement and a parking agreement and different construction loan agreements. Those were all the basic terms and conditions on how rights and obligations going forward with land and revenue streams in the Downtown East project were going to get divvied up among all the various parties. You'll note in this case, all of those agreements ultimately got done on February 10th. The resolution was adopted in December. We spent 2 months working through all these kinds of documents. And until we had those underlying contractual agreements among the parties, we did not have a transaction that we could finance yet because we didn't have a contractual obligation to give us revenue that we could then use to pay the bonds. So what happened in this case is those agreements all got done on February 10th. Later that week, we were in the market selling bonds, and everything cascades from there. The vehicle to sell the bonds, as well as other things, is the biggest document I sent along in the presentation. It's called an official statement. That is where we lay out all the parameters from an official disclosure standpoint about the characteristics of this transaction, and perhaps most importantly from the lender's perspective, the disclosures of relevant city financial information. What makes me think that you're a good bet to pay me back if I lend you money now? If you go into the guts of that thing, the description of the project is a couple of pages. We include a big section, but not all, of our annual audit report. And we include 50 or 60 pages of general disclosure about what's important for what we think is important for a investor to understand as to how the city is operating and where we are financially. Because it's not just in the audit from, at that point, the end of 2012 when we're selling bonds in early 14. So we describe in there to great degrees things about our budgetary process, council process, pension situations, et cetera, none of which is easily discernible from our audited financials, but we have a obligation to disclose all matters that might be material and not skip anything that would be material, basically. And part of the reason I'm pausing on that is that's exactly why, as we go through all of these processes about budget, but really about financial management, we want you guys to understand how this is an ongoing dynamic equation. We can't put into an offering document materials that give an investor a reasonably current snapshot of what's going on with the city unless we're working together to make sure that the information is known and we are making those kinds of planful, intentional decisions. There are ultimately a number of different ways that interest rates are set on a bond issue. There's a bid-like way, there's an auction-like way. The mechanics we can talk about later if you want, but in any of those cases, our objective always remains to have a interest rate set that is as low as we possibly can and still get people to lend us the money. The outcome becomes, and again, this goes a little bit to the difference between a bond offering as a series of loans. You will see in this case for Downtown East, which ended up being $61,905 million of principal, this is a series of bonds all in the same package. So we have different maturities. We had $575,000 of principal maturing in 2019 that carries an interest rate of 1.85. All down out the maturity spectrum, including the lion's share in the bottom in these things called term bonds. All right. This is to some degree arcane bonding, but it's what makes, in essence, this a little bit different than your mortgage. You aren't doing a series of loans generally in your mortgage. You might be doing an adjustable rate mortgage, but then it refinances. So then we offer the bonds, we get bids, we sign the deal up, and eventually we have to close. The rest of these documents, besides the underlying financial documents that were executed on February 10th, are all in way, shapes, or forms closing documents. So various parties make different kinds of certifications and reps and warranties. We get opinions from various lawyers that this is all legal and valid. And ultimately we closed, this one we closed on March 4th. And closing in this sense just meant bond investors were giving us, for all intents and purposes, $61,905,000, and we were giving them promise notes that promises to repay their principal amount and interest. And we had our $61 million to go buy land and build parking ramps and do other things in the Downtown East project. Rating agencies are an important, but sometimes in my opinion, overstated in importance in this process. The city's current general obligation ratings, we are AAA from each of Fitch and S&P, and we are AA1, which is the first notch below AAA, from Moody's. The Common Bond Fund, referring back to that other slide, because it's a specialized financial vehicle and has a different level of pledges, is rated currently A+ and is only rated at the moment by S&P. Ratings are important. I don't want to, it is true that all else being equal, a higher rating will lead to a lower borrowing cost. It's a credit underwriting decision, just like a bank does without the benefit of a rating. They are also in some form of an independent indicator of financial strength. There's a good housekeeping seal of approval aspect to it that's very important in a variety of negotiations about why, for example, the Timberwolves should give us security to be able to access our credit, because we are a good credit and can borrow cheaply. At the end of the day, it's all about increasing the lenders or the market's confidence in your ability. You've pledged to pay, but then you got to do it to pay them back. It's important to note that there are a variety of other factors besides ratings that impact your interest rate on a given bond. The length of the bond, is the prior schedule, obviously matters. You have to pay 1% to borrow money for a year, and you have to pay 5% to borrow it for 30. Things like options that you have to redeem bonds early play in directly to the value of that bond. So ratings are one of many factors that determine interest rates. Lastly, I want to talk about just the criteria on rating agencies. It is not a magic, quantitatively driven black box from the rating agency's perspective. They have put out detailed criteria that are a mix of qualitative and quantitative. The vast majority of them are actually qualitative, not quantitative. So 910 million outstanding would be a marker, but way more important to the rating agencies are things like their sense of the economic growth of the region, their sense of our financial management policies and financial management capabilities. Just to indulge me for a second, I'll read you the highlights from S&P's report, their executive summary on the Downtown East. Rating reflects our assessment of the following factors for the city: strong economy, which benefits from participation in the broad and diverse economy of the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan statistical area. Very strong budgetary flexibility, with 2014 audited reserves at 24% of general fund expenditures, tying it back to the earlier discussion about the fourth quarter report. Strong budgetary performance, as opposed to flexibility, with city planning to use some of its reserves in fiscal 2014, largely for one-time expenditures. Very strong liquidity, providing very strong cash levels to cover both debt service and expenditures. Very strong management with very strong financial practices, and adequate debt and contingent liability positions with rapid amortization of direct debt. The only one that really gets into some relative quantitative one on a debt basis. The rest is more macro. Moody's said very similar things. So I wish I could predict the future a little bit on how actions we take would affect our rating. I can't, and that's okay. Lastly, and takeaways. They are extremely important tools for us, and they have big long-term consequences. We will spend about $33 million in 2014 to pay interest on that $910 million. It is, however, a flexible tool that needs to balance the use of our existing cash. Ms. Griffith pointed out we are now up to enterprise-wide close to $700 million in cash. So managing when we use cash versus when we bond is an ongoing dynamic equation. In managing not just for today, but with a view towards reasonable expectations about what's going to happen in the future, some of which we have better ability to control, i.e. setting property tax levies in the near term and longer term, much of which is outside of our control. Also wanted to point out the legal compliance regulatory environment continues to get stricter, more strident in terms of the hoops you have to jump through to get access to the tax exemption or even municipal authority. That comes not only with issuance requirements, but ongoing disclosure and monitoring requirements. It is also true that, again, this goes a little bit to the rating agency point, not all AAA credits get priced the same way. There are differentiations between there. It is critically important that we be able, they don't take lightly putting the word very in front of their commentary that's strong. And they will have strong management in some cases on a AAA rated credit. We get paid for that in some levels by a lower borrowing cost. And lastly, and this is a big, just keep this in the back of your mind from an overall perspective, there remain periodic inquiries by the federal government as to ways to restrict tax exemption. From the federal government's perspective, it is one of many solutions that they frequently put up to deal with their own budget issues, because they aren't receiving tax revenue from everybody who has tax-exempt holdings. So there are, in almost every legislative session in Congress, various proposals to constrain, restrict, somehow address tax exemption. And there is no doubt that it's hard to quantify, but anything they do that changes that, reduces it, would in fact raise our borrowing costs, prima facie. That wasn't quite as high level as I meant it to be, but there's way more detail if you want it. I have no further prepared remarks. Happy to stand for any questions. Bruce or the lawyers from Kennedy and Graven, I'm sure, could also.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carpenter. Any questions or comments that anyone would like to make? Good. Go ahead, Vice President Glidden.
Sorry.
Sorry.
You know, I just kind of wanted to go back to the bond rating because, you know, we talk a lot about how important the bond rating is, and I know you discussed some of the points on there, but, you know, I think that we have done a lot of work in the city of Minneapolis to ensure that we are getting a better bond rating and maintaining the bond rating. And I just wondered if you could say a few more words about, you know, why should we care? You know, can you, maybe I'll just leave it at that. So,
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Glidden, we should care because it does matter on our costs. If we were to move to an A rating from all three agencies from our current position, I would guess, depending on a lot of other factors, but plus or minus, it would cost us 0.5% more at least per bond to issue that debt. So if we used to be able to issue a 20-year bond at 3.5%, it would cost us 4% if we were at single A from all three. That's the direct reason to care. The indirect reason to care, from my perspective and from our staff's perspective, is it does serve as an important beacon of our capabilities on a stewardship basis and the value proposition that we are offering to all those who come in contact with us. Gold Star cities, driving down the highway, AAA rated cities are a relatively small set of cities. They are nowhere near, you know, every city is different. Every city has different combinations of what they care about or govern. Some have school districts, some are coterminous with counties, etc. But there is, in my sense, a palpable sense of pride we should take in our stewardship to be at the higher ends of these rating categories. It didn't make me lose any sleep to drop from AAA on Moody's to AA1, because I know what's behind that, and it's something that will work itself out, and we will be AAA if we maintain our vigilance again someday. And we are still getting paid as if we're a AAA from an interest rate perspective. So it's that mix of qualitative and quantitative. It is absolutely true that it lowers your borrowing costs, but it's only true to the extent that there is a fundamentally valid. The market can see through credits. They are just sophisticated. They don't need the rating agencies to tell them what a city of Minneapolis. But it's a shortcut method for them. We will get their attention at AAA. Then they will do more judgment. So it's a mix of those things.
Yeah. And beyond pride, it's a statement of confidence.
Yeah.
Well-managed enterprise, and we need to be able to talk about that from a competitive standpoint as we seek to attract new businesses. So that's a very valid reason to be pursuing highest ratings as possible. Good. Well, obviously, it's a lot of information. It was a tremendous report, and just the start of a long summer ahead of us. Would you care to go into the initial budget schedule item on the agenda, or is that going to be Ms. Green going to be handling that for us? We'll take all three of these items, I think, at once. But I think I just wanted to share, as Mr. Carpenter started his presentation, kicking off, this is a series of communications with our colleagues on the council as well as the public about how we're going to go about the process of reviewing our financial performance over the past year. And as we're tying that back to our goals and visions that we just adopted last week, and how we blend those into business models and department business plans, and how they all collide with a big budget speech as we end the year passing a 2015 budget. So if you could go over the budget schedule as a little highlight, and then we could talk about the next 3 Ways and Means Committee's topics that we'll be covering. Go ahead, Ms. Green.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to just come before you today, just tell you just a couple of key dates that you should be familiar with, or if it's not really dates, but time periods that you should be familiar with. Departments will soon be in the process of starting to put together programs in order for the mayor to review, in order to make decisions about what her priorities are and what programs she will include in her budget. That will be the first week of June that departments should have that done. In the month of June and in the month of July, departments will be meeting with the mayor in order to have conversations about those particular programs in order to help the mayor make decisions about what she will include. Then in August 15th, by August 15th, the mayor will present her budget to council. And then after that happens, then it transfers, the budget is submitted to the council, and then I don't really know what to call it now because we've changed it a little bit. It normally would just, Ways and Means would actually have these hearings, and council would, other council members that's not a part of Ways and Means would be invited to all of these, what we call hearings. And then that normally happens in September and October. And then some couple of dates that the council should be aware of is November 18th. We're proposing that date as the public comment date, and that's the public comment for the levy. What we do, and when I say we, meaning you, we allow the constituents to come in and have a conversation about what the proposed levy is that the mayor has proposed. I'll step back a little bit also because I forgot to tell you that also we have maximum levies that we propose, or that the Board of Estimate and Taxation will be voting on, and then that's really what the constituents will be actually coming in and talking about that and giving you some guidance about maybe putting in more programs, taking some programs out in order to reduce the levy or increase, well, you can't increase it, but in order to make decisions about that. So most likely what's happening is conversations are wanting you to shift from one program to another, or from one department to another. December 2nd and December 4th, that's when Ways and Means have an opportunity to make changes to the budget that the mayor has proposed. And then everyone has an opportunity, everyone on the council has an opportunity on December 10th. At least these are the proposed dates on December 10th in order to make changes, make recommendations for the budget, and actually ultimately adopt the budget. And immediately following the adoption of the budget by the council, the Board of Estimate and Taxation ratifies the levy.
Very good.
And I'll stand for questions.
That looks fine to me. I think it's broad enough that without being as much detail on specific dates and what the public hearings will be, although my office has certainly proposed that series, and we'll be dealing with the department heads through that early part of the summer as we finalize those. Do you think, Councilmember Glidden, I could use your guidance on this. Do we need to adopt this as a committee action, this third item? Ms. Hanson, do you think? This is just receive and file. I think it would be appropriate. Certainly on items 20 and 21, and then the initial budget schedule will also probably do that as a receive and file. Lisa, is that correct? Thank you. Okay, good. Thank you very much. All closed. Thank you. So on those 3 discussion items that we had today, again, thank you to staff for all of the in-depth work you did to prepare this material, and I'm sure the auditor will think this is a beauty piece of work and not give you any questions or thoughts. So that'll be passed. So on those 3 items, if we could receive and file those items, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And that item passes. passes. Those 3 items do. And I think that concludes our business today. So this meeting will stand adjourned. Thank you.